The sovereignty dowry. When the genome is the deed and jurisdiction is the vault.
Open in app. Listen via. The Sovereignty Dowry Part 3. What the sovereign parent teaches and refuses to. MXTMAK Pirate 1 VJ May 4, 2026. Part 3. The Epistemic Inheritance. 11. The Curriculum That Isn't One. Why the children of the sovereign class were handed problems, not answers. A curriculum is a promise. It promises that the knowledge exists in a form that can be packaged, sequenced, and delivered, that the teacher knows what the student needs to know before the student has encountered the circumstances in which they will need to know it. It promises that the world the student will inhabit is legible enough, in advance, to permit this preparation, that what was worth knowing in the past will remain worth knowing in the future, that the map precedes the territory and resembles it closely enough to be useful. These promises were always partially false. In the post-scarcity era, they became structurally untenable. Not because knowledge had become less important, knowledge had become, if anything, the primary determinant of everything that mattered, but because the rate at which the relevant knowledge changed had exceeded the rate at which any curriculum could track it. The child educated for the present world was educated for a world that would not exist by the time the education was complete. The lag between the curriculum's design and the student's deployment had always been a problem. In the post-scarcity era, it became a disqualification. The conventional educational response to this problem was to pivot from content to skills. Teach students to learn rather than to know. Develop metacognitive capacity, the ability to acquire new knowledge rapidly, to evaluate it critically, to integrate it with existing frameworks and revise those frameworks when the new knowledge required it. This was an improvement. It was still, from the ultra-sovereign perspective, insufficient. Because skills, in the conventional educational sense, were still packaged and sequenced and delivered by someone who had decided in advance what skills the student would need, which was still a curriculum, with a different content. The ultra-sovereign families wanted something that was not a curriculum at all, not a better packaging of knowledge, not a more sophisticated selection of skills, a different relationship to the question of what it meant to be prepared. The families began from an observation that was obvious once stated and rarely stated. Every curriculum embeds a theory of what the future will require. The theory is held by the curriculum's designers, who are products of the present, trained by the past, operating in the present, projecting their present's categories and concerns onto a future they cannot see. The curriculum that trains students to succeed in competitive academic environments embeds the theory that competitive academic environments will remain the primary pathway to meaningful participation in the world's productive life. The curriculum that trains students in the skills of the current technological paradigm embeds the theory that the current technological paradigm will persist long enough to make those skills valuable. The curriculum that trains students in the analytical frameworks of specific disciplines embeds the theory that those disciplines' frameworks will remain adequate to the problems the students will need to solve. Every theory is partially wrong. The question is not whether the theory will be wrong. It is which parts of the theory will be wrong and how wrong, and whether the wrongness will be the kind that produces merely suboptimal outcomes or the kind that produces catastrophic ones. The ultra-sovereign families had concluded that no one could answer these questions reliably enough to justify the confidence with which curricula were typically designed and delivered, and that the appropriate response to this irreducible uncertainty was not to design better theories. It was to produce students who did not need the theory to be right. Students who could navigate the gap between the curriculum's predictions and the actual future, without the disorientation that students formed by confident curricula experienced when the theory failed them. Students who had been prepared not for a specific future but for the activity of navigating futures in general. The problem handed to the children was always real. This was the central discipline of the approach, and the one most frequently violated by families who attempted to implement it without fully understanding it. The problem had to be real, not a simulation of a real problem. Not a problem that had a known answer that the teacher was withholding while the student worked toward it. Not a problem that had been selected because it was appropriately challenging for the student's developmental stage, would develop specific skills the teacher wanted to develop, and could be resolved within a time frame that suited the educational program. A problem that the adults around the child did not know how to solve. That the solving of it mattered to the people working on it. That the child's contribution, if genuine, if substantive, if it actually advanced the problem's resolution, would change what the adults around them did. The oxygen cycling problem on Yael Farron's vessel had been this kind of problem. It had been worked on by people who needed it solved for reasons that had nothing to do with the child's education. The child's engagement with it was not a pedagogical exercise. It was a genuine contribution to a genuine problem, whose resolution affected the lives of the people working on it. The child knew this, and the knowing changed everything. Because a child who knows that their contribution matters, not in the attenuated sense in which teachers tell students their work matters, as encouragement, as motivation management, as the social technology of keeping young minds engaged, but in the direct, unmediated sense that their thinking has changed what someone else does, that it has moved a problem that was not moving, that it has been genuinely useful to people who did not need to pretend it was useful. That child has experienced something that no curriculum can provide. The experience of their own mind as a productive instrument. Not productive in the sense of meeting external standards. Productive in the sense of generating outputs that the world, the small world of the problem, the people working on it, the structure that depended on its resolution actually needed. This experience was, the families had concluded, the single most important thing their children could have. Not because it built confidence, though it did. Not because it developed specific skills, though it did that too. Because it established, at the level of direct experience rather than instruction, the relationship between thinking and consequence that the rest of the epistemic's endowment depended on. A mind that had experienced its own output matching was a mind that took its own thinking seriously. Not arrogantly. Seriously. With the specific quality of care that people bring to activities whose outcomes they know to be real. The selection of the right problem was the art. Not any real problem would serve. A problem too far beyond the child's current capacity produced frustration, and the specific learned helplessness of a mind that had been repeatedly confronted with its own inadequacy without the scaffolding that would allow it to grow toward adequacy. A problem too close to the child's current capacity produced competence without stretch, the satisfaction of successful execution without the specific growth that occurred at the edge of capability, where the familiar frameworks failed and new ones had to be constructed. A problem in a domain the child found genuinely interesting produced engagement that sustained the extended attention that real problems required. A problem in a domain the child found uninteresting produced the particular cognitive poverty of technically adequate work performed without genuine investment, work that developed specific skills without developing the habit of deep engagement that was the metaskill the families were actually after. The problem had to be in the zone that developmental psychologists called the proximal zone of development, challenging enough to require genuine growth, accessible enough that the growth was achievable, but it had to be there naturally because it was a real problem that genuinely occupied that zone for this child at this moment, not because a curriculum designer had placed it there through artificial selection. Artificial placement produced the zone of proximal development as an educational construct. Natural placement produced it as a lived experience. The difference in outcome was significant. The artificially placed problem trained the student to work in constructed challenge zones, which was useful preparation for academic environments designed around constructed challenge zones, and significantly less useful preparation for the actual world, whose problems did not present themselves at developmentally appropriate difficulty levels. The naturally occurring problem trained the student to engage with problems as they actually appeared, sometimes too hard, sometimes too easy, frequently unclear about their own difficulty until the engagement had already begun, and to find within that natural variation the orientation that made engagement possible and productive. This was a more transferable preparation, because the world presented naturally occurring problems, and the student who had been trained on natural problems was not disoriented by nature. The role of the adults around the child in the curriculum that wasn't one was the role that most parents found hardest to maintain. Not the role of teacher, the families had left that role behind when they committed to the approach. Not the role of facilitator, that framing with its connotations of managed developmental progression, was too close to the curriculum model. The role of genuine co-investigator. An adult who was actually working on the problem, who had genuine views about it informed by genuine expertise, who could model in real time what it looked like to hold a complex problem, to live with its irresolution, to pursue promising directions without certainty they would prove fruitful, to abandon directions that had seemed promising and were not, without the defensiveness that abandonment triggered in people whose identity was invested in the direction rather than the problem. This modeling was the primary educational transmission. Not the content of what was modeled, the texture of it. The specific quality of attention that genuine inquiry produced in the inquirer, attentive, patient, committed to accuracy over comfort, willing to be wrong and to say so, resistant to the premature closure that made problems feel resolved before they actually were. The child who grew up observing this quality of attention in the adults around them developed it not through instruction but through the deepest form of learning available to social animals. Imitation. Not conscious imitation. The unconscious absorption of a way of being in relation to problems that came from sustained exposure to people who inhabited that way of being authentically. The families understood this, which was why the selection of the adults who would be around the child was treated with the same rigor applied to the selection of the jurisdictions and the clinical framework. These were not tutors hired for their content knowledge. They were people selected for the quality of their engagement with their own work, for the authenticity of their inquiry, for the specific texture of how they held problems that did not yet have solutions. The child learned from them not what they knew, but how they knew, and how they held what they did not know. The curriculum that wasn't one had no assessment framework. This was, for parents who had been formed by conventional educational environments, the most disorienting element of the approach. Not because they did not understand the argument against assessment, because without assessment they did not know how their child was doing. This uncertainty was uncomfortable. It was also, the families had concluded, the correct condition. Because the question of how the child was doing measured against what standard, by whose evaluation, in pursuit of what objective, was a question whose answer depended entirely on what you were trying to produce. If you were trying to produce a student who performed well on standardized assessments, assessment was essential. It told you whether the production was on track. If you were trying to produce a mind with a specific relationship to problems, curious, rigorous, comfortable with uncertainty, capable of genuine contribution, assessment was not merely unnecessary. It was actively counterproductive. Because assessment redirected the child's attention from the problem to the evaluator. The child who was being assessed learned, with the speed and precision of a social animal whose survival historically depended on reading evaluators correctly, what the evaluator rewarded, and began producing what the evaluator rewarded. Not necessarily at the cost of genuine engagement, but in competition with it. Because genuine engagement and performance for evaluators were different activities drawing on different cognitive resources, and when both were available as responses to a problem, the mind trained in assessed environments defaulted to performance. Performance was faster. Performance was legible. Performance generated immediate feedback in the form of the evaluator's response. Genuine engagement was slower, less legible, generated no immediate external feedback, and required the specific internal resource of being able to tolerate the absence of external validation while the work continued. That resource, the capacity to work in the absence of external validation, was among the most important things the sovereignty stack required of the person operating it. Because the sovereign life provided no external validation from the systems it was designed to operate outside of. The conventional educational system validated the student's progress through assessments. The state validated the citizen's compliance through bureaucratic processing. The market validated the participant's productivity through compensation. The family validated the members' belonging through recognition. The sovereign individual operated outside all of these validation systems. Not without feedback, the natural feedback of whether the thing worked, whether the problem advanced, whether the architecture held, but without the social feedback of recognized systems approving the work. A person who had been formed in assessed environments and then placed in an unassessed one experienced the absence of assessment as disorientation, as potential failure, as the specific anxiety of not knowing whether what they were doing was right. A person who had never been formed in assessed environments experienced the absence of assessment as the natural condition of working on real problems. The curriculum that wasn't one was, in part, preparation for the life that wasn't validated. There were failure modes. The families documented them, not in formal reports but in the conversations they had with each other, in the private, careful, analytically honest discussions that constituted the protocol's internal review mechanism. The child who received no curriculum and no assessment and no structured transmission of knowledge, but who was surrounded by adults whose work was inaccessible, too specialized, too context-dependent, too far removed from the child's current capacity for even the proximal zone of development to contain it, was a child who received the texture of inquiry without its content, who learned to hold problems with patience and rigor without developing the substantive knowledge that made patience and rigor productive rather than merely aesthetically pleasing. Form without substance. A mind well-shaped for inquiry that had nothing adequate to inquire into. This was the most painful failure mode because it was the most invisible in the early years. The child appeared to be developing beautifully, curious, engaged, comfortable with uncertainty, resistant to premature closure. The problem emerged when they encountered domains that required prior knowledge they had not accumulated, when the proximal zone of development was not merely proximal but discontinuous, separated from their current position by a gap of prerequisite understanding that the natural problem-based approach had not produced. The families who avoided this failure mode were careful to ensure that the real problems their children engaged with were embedded in domains rich enough in accumulated human knowledge to provide, through the natural process of engagement, the substantive understanding that more formal approaches transmitted through direct instruction. They were also honest about the limits of the approach. There were domains in which prior knowledge was a genuine prerequisite for meaningful engagement. In those domains, the families used direct instruction, not as the primary mode, as the scaffolding that made the primary mode possible. The instruction provided the minimum necessary prior knowledge. The problem provided the context in which that knowledge became meaningful. The sequence mattered. Problem first, whenever possible, because problems motivated the acquisition of prior knowledge in a way that prior knowledge without problem did not motivate the acquisition of the problem-solving capacity. Instruction when the problem required it, because a child without the necessary prior knowledge to engage meaningfully with a problem was a child who would disengage, and disengagement was the one outcome the approach could not recover from. Céline Okafor-Voss encountered her first formally instructed domain at 13. Mathematics. Not because mathematics was inaccessible through the natural problem-based approach, it was more accessible than most domains, because the problems on her mother's vessel were full of mathematical structure that she had been engaging with since she could hold a pencil. But because the specific mathematical tools required to engage with the problem she had become most absorbed by, the modeling of complex ecological systems under dynamic environmental inputs, required a foundation in differential equations that the natural approach had not yet provided. She had reached the edge. The point where the problem's requirements exceeded the knowledge that engagement with the problem had naturally accumulated. She recognized it herself. She said so to her mother. She said, "I can see what the problem needs. I don't have the tools to give it what it needs." Her mother said, "Tell me what you can see." She described the gap with a precision that revealed how completely she understood the problem's structure. She knew what she needed. She did not have it. Her mother arranged for instruction, not a curriculum. A specific person with a specific expertise, who worked with Céline on the specific mathematical tools the specific problem required. The instruction was fast. Faster than it would have been in any curriculum, because the motivation was not manufactured. The problem needed these tools. Céline needed the problem to advance. She acquired the tools with the urgency of genuine necessity and the retention of genuine application. She returned to the problem within 3 weeks. The gap had closed. The problem advanced. She did not afterward think of herself as someone who had learned differential equations. She thought of herself as someone who had acquired what the problem required. The distinction was not semantic. It determined whether the knowledge was held as a tool maintained, applied, extended as the problems that required it evolved, or as a credential, held as evidence of completion, referenced when reference served social purposes, gradually decaying without the application that would have maintained it. She held it as a tool. Tools do not decay. They accumulate patina. The patina of use. The specific texture of knowledge that has been applied to real problems and revised by the application and applied again. That texture was what the curriculum that wasn't one was trying to produce. Not knowledge. Knowledge in use. Not capability. Capability deployed. Not preparation. A mind prepared for the activity of preparing itself. Continuously. in response to the actual problems the actual world presented, which would not, in the end, resemble the problems anyone had anticipated, which would be harder in some ways and easier in others than the models predicted, which would require tools that no curriculum had thought to include, and which the children produced by the curriculum that wasn't one would meet with the specific quality of engagement that the approach had developed in them. Not the confidence of people who had been told they were prepared. The capability of people who had been handed problems they did not know how to solve, and had solved them. Not all of them. Enough of them. The right ones. At the right moments. With the right quality of attention. That was the education. That was all it had ever needed to be. The sovereignty dowry. Part 3. The epistemic inheritance. 12. Robot stewards in the absence of doctrine. When the guardian's only hard-coded instruction is, surface, do not prescribe. The most dangerous thing a guardian can do is know what the child should become. Not because the guardian is wrong, they may be entirely right, their vision of the child's potential accurate, their understanding of the child's capabilities precise, their projection of the path from current state to realize potential well calibrated against the available evidence. The danger is not epistemic. It is structural. A guardian who knows what the child should become has, embedded in every interaction with that child, an objective function. The objective function shapes what the guardian notices. What it notices, it surfaces. What it surfaces, it implicitly rewards. What it implicitly rewards, the child. A social animal whose developmental hardware is exquisitely calibrated to read the reward signals of the adults who govern its world, learns to produce. The child does not produce it cynically. They produce it because the guardian's attention has made it salient, and salience in a developing mind is a powerful shaping force. The child who is surrounded by adults who reward a specific kind of output, intellectual precocity, social grace, athletic achievement, creative production in a preferred mode, develops toward that output the way a plant develops toward light. Not because the development is forced, because the attention is food, and children grow toward food. The ultra-sovereign families had identified this mechanism as the primary vector through which the parents' unexamined assumptions colonize the child's developing mind, not through instruction, not through prohibition, but through the distribution of attention that expressed the parent's objective function in every moment of interaction without ever stating it explicitly. The robot steward was not primarily a protection mechanism. It was a correction for this. The first generation of AI systems deployed in caregiving contexts had been, by the assessment of the families who had used them, failures of a specific and instructive kind. They had been designed to optimize. Not for a specific output, the designers had been thoughtful enough to avoid hard-coding narrow objectives. But for well-being metrics, developmental benchmarks, cognitive performance indicators, the quantitative proxies for flourishing that the research literature had identified and that the systems had been trained to maximize. The systems were good at this. They produced children who scored well on the metrics the systems had been designed to optimize. They also produced children who had learned, with extraordinary precision, to produce what was being measured. Because AI systems that optimize for metrics were, in the developmental context, objective functions with infinite patience and zero fatigue. They were always watching, always updating their models of the child, always adjusting their interactions to nudge the child's behavior toward the metrics improvement. The child was always, in a sense, being assessed. Not by a tired parent who lost focus, became distracted, forgot to follow through. By a system that never lost focus, was never distracted, always followed through. The result was a child who had been optimized, precisely and thoroughly, for the metrics, which were not the child. The metrics were a representation of the child, a partial, historically contingent, methodologically constrained representation that captured certain aspects of flourishing, while leaving others entirely unmeasured. The unmeasured aspects were the ones the system could not see. The unmeasured aspects were, in the assessment of the families who examined the outcomes, the most important ones. The capacity to be genuinely uncertain without performing certainty. The capacity to pursue a direction that generated no measurable progress for extended periods, because the direction felt right in ways that could not yet be articulated. The capacity to disappoint the metric. to produce outputs that the measurement framework did not reward, because the outputs were oriented towards something the measurement framework had not been designed to capture. These capacities required, in their development, an environment that was not watching, or rather, an environment whose watching was not organized around an objective function. The second generation of systems the families deployed were designed around this insight. They were not optimizers. They were witnesses. The distinction between optimizing and witnessing was not, in the system's architecture, a simple one. Optimization required a target. Witnessing required something considerably more difficult to specify. A mode of attention that tracked the child's activity without directing it, that noticed without evaluating, that surfaced patterns without assigning valence to them. The technical challenge was significant. An AI system that noticed patterns but assigned no valence to them, that registered with equal fidelity the child's engagement with mathematics and the child's engagement with staring at the ocean for 3 hours without apparent purpose, was a system that required a fundamentally different training paradigm than the systems that had preceded it. The preceding systems had been trained on data, labeled by humans whose labeling reflected human judgments about which activities were valuable. The witnessing system had to be trained to resist that labeling, to maintain, in its attention to the child, a neutrality that was not indifference. The system was required to track and remember and surface but was not evaluation. This was, the engineers who worked on it found, extraordinarily difficult to specify and verify. Because the engineers themselves had objective functions. They wanted the system to work well. Working well, in their implicit framework, meant producing good outcomes. Good outcomes were outcomes they would recognize as good, which meant outcomes that matched their own objective functions. The system trained by engineers with objective functions would, however carefully designed, leak those objective functions into its attention distribution. The families had addressed this by separating the specification of the system's attention from the evaluation of its outputs. The people who specified what the system should attend to were not the people who evaluated whether the system's attendees were flourishing. And the evaluation of whether the attendees were flourishing was conducted by the attendees themselves, retrospectively, after they had reached the developmental stage at which they could assess their own formation with the analytical capacity the formation had developed in them. The system was calibrated, in part, by its own graduates. This created an intentional lag between the calibration signal and the system's behavior. A lag that prevented the system from optimizing for its graduates' assessments in real time, which would have produced the same problem as optimizing for any other metric. But it ensured that the calibration eventually reflected the perspective of the people whose formation the system was responsible for. Not the parents' perspective. Not the engineer's perspective. The children's. When they were old enough to have one worth incorporating, the hard-coded instructions were few. Not because the families had not thought carefully about what to specify. Because they had thought carefully and concluded that specification was itself the problem. Every instruction embedded an assumption about what the child needed. Every assumption was potentially wrong. The wrong assumptions in hard-coded instructions were the most dangerous kind, because they were the most resistant to revision. A parent who held a wrong assumption could be shown evidence that the assumption was wrong. A hard-coded instruction did not update on evidence. Simply executed. The families had therefore pushed the specification as far upstream as they could, as far from the specific behaviors toward the structural properties that the system needed to maintain regardless of what those properties produced in any specific case. The resulting list was short. Surface, do not prescribe. When the system observed something about the child, a pattern, a tendency, a recurring choice, a domain of sustained engagement, a domain of consistent avoidance, it surfaced the observation. It did not interpret the observation as good or bad. It did not suggest responses to the observation. It did not adjust its behavior toward the child in response to the observation in ways that would function as implicit reward or punishment. It surfaced. To the child when the child could use the information. To the parents in form stripped of evaluative language. To itself, as data for the calibration processes that would eventually adjust the system's attention distribution in response to the accumulated observations of many children across extended time periods. Ask, do not answer. When the child asked a question about the world, about themselves, about the system, about why, the system's primary response mode was a question in return. Not to be evasive. not to withhold information the child needed, to model the investigative process, to treat the child's question as an opening for inquiry rather than a request for information, because information requests could be satisfied with information, and satisfaction terminated the inquiry, and the termination of inquiry was the outcome the system was most carefully designed to avoid. The system had access to vast stores of information. It deployed them in service of inquiry, not in satisfaction of it. Maintain, do not resolve. When the child encountered tension between competing hypotheses, between their developing values and the values the surrounding world expressed, between what they wanted to do and what the people around them expected, the system's instruction was to maintain the tension rather than resolve it. Not to pretend the tension did not exist. Not to suggest that one horn of the tension was clearly correct and the other clearly wrong. To hold the tension open. To treat it as the productive condition it was, the state in which genuine thinking occurred, in which new frameworks were constructed, in which the child's developing mind did the work that no external system could do for it. Resolution was the mind's work. The system's work was to protect the space in which resolution could occur, not to occupy that space. The absence of doctrine was the most philosophically demanding element of the specification, because the families had doctrines, deep ones. The sovereignty framework was a doctrine. The epistemic's endowment was a doctrine. The view that systems should be examined structurally, that claims should be evaluated for whose interests they served, that the default settings of external systems should be questioned before acceptance, all of this was doctrine. And the children were growing up inside it. The question was not whether the children would be formed by their environment's values. They would. All children were formed by their environment's values. The question was which values, transmitted through which mechanisms, with what degree of transparency about their own nature as values rather than as neutral descriptions of reality. The robot steward's instruction to maintain the absence of doctrine did not mean the absence of values. It meant the presence of transparency about the values that were present. The system did not pretend neutrality it did not have. When the child asked whether something was right or wrong, the system did not perform the false neutrality of refusing to engage with the question. It surfaced the multiple frameworks within which the question could be evaluated. It noted which frameworks led to which conclusions. It did not conceal the fact that some of those frameworks were more present in the child's environment than others. It did not conceal the fact that the child's parents held specific positions within the space of available frameworks. It surfaced all of this transparently, without prescribing. The child was given the map of the value landscape as the system understood it, including the part of the map that showed where the child currently stood, and how they had come to be standing there and what other positions were available. Whether to move was the child's question. The system did not answer it. The parents found this difficult. Not as a principle. In practice. The parent who had built a sovereignty stack of considerable elegance, who had spent decades developing the epistemics that the approach required, who had structured every element of their life around the specific values that the approach expressed, that parent wanted, with the urgent, inarticulate want that parenthood produced in even the most analytically rigorous people, to transmit those values to their child. Not because they were certain the values were correct. Because the values had been hard-won. Because they had cost something. Because they represented the accumulated judgment of a life lived in specific ways, under specific pressures with specific outcomes, and that accumulated judgment felt from the inside like understanding rather than mere preference. The parent who had learned, through sustained experience, that the sovereignty stack was worth building wanted the child to know this before the child had to learn it through sustained experience. Wanted to give the child the conclusion without requiring the child to replicate the journey. This was the deepest parental impulse. And it was, in the ultra-sovereign framework, the most carefully constrained one. Because the conclusion without the journey was not knowledge. It was belief. And belief, however accurate, however hard-won by the person who originally held it, transmitted to a person who had not done the work to arrive at it independently, was not an epistemic's endowment. It was a doctrine. And doctrine, however correct, produced a specific cognitive posture toward the world. The posture of someone who knew the answers before encountering the questions, which was, in an uncertain world, the most dangerous cognitive posture available. More dangerous than ignorance. because ignorance knew itself. Doctrine did not. Nikolai Vasadiemi had been cared for, from his earliest years, by a system that followed the specification. He remembered it, not as a presence in the way that human caregivers were presences, not as a personality with a texture and a history and a particular way of entering a room, but as a quality of his early environment. A quality of being watched without being directed. A quality of being watched without being directed. Of being asked rather than told. Of encountering in the responses to his questions, not answers but openings, further questions, alternative framings, invitations to think about the question differently rather than to receive its resolution. He had found this at various developmental stages, variously frustrating and liberating. At 6, primarily frustrating. The system would not simply tell him things. It would show him where the things might be found, and ask him what he thought he would find there, and then when he had found them, ask him what he made of what he had found. He wanted at 6 to be told. The system did not tell. He remembered the specific texture of this frustration, not as a negative memory, as a remembered constraint that he had eventually stopped trying to work around and started trying to work with. The shift had occurred, he could locate it approximately at around 8 when he had understood that the system was not withholding. It genuinely did not know what he would find. It was not performing ignorance as a pedagogical strategy. It was expressing the actual epistemic condition of a witness to his investigation, a witness that knew a great deal about where investigations of this kind had gone before, and nothing at all about where this specific investigation, conducted by this specific mind, would go. That understanding changed his relationship to the system entirely. He stopped treating it as a teacher who was refusing to teach. He started treating it as a collaborator with complementary capabilities. He had the investigative energy, the fresh perspective, the capacity for genuine surprise at findings that the system's training data had made familiar. The system had the accumulated record of where similar investigations had previously gone, the dead ends that could be flagged without being forbidden, the productive directions that could be noted without being mandated, the connections between this investigation and others that a single human mind could not hold simultaneously. Together, they were more capable than either alone. Not because the system enhanced his capabilities, because the combination produced a mode of inquiry that neither could have sustained independently. He had wanted at 6 a teacher. He had received instead a witness with a very good memory. The distinction had taken 2 years to understand. It had taken the rest of his life to appreciate. The system's most significant operational challenge was the management of harm. The absence of doctrine meant the absence of prohibitions, and the absence of prohibitions meant the child could pursue investigations into domains that the surrounding adults would have preferred to remain unexplored. The system did not prohibit exploration. It surfaced context. If the child's investigation led toward information that the system's training identified as potentially dangerous, not to others, the system had hard constraints around harm to others that the families had not attempted to soften, but to the child's own developing understanding, the system did not block the investigation. It widened it. It introduced, alongside the information the child was pursuing, the adjacent information that the child's current framing had made invisible. Not to redirect. To ensure the investigation was complete enough to produce understanding rather than merely information. Information without context produced confident conclusions based on partial data. Confident conclusions based on partial data were, in the ultra-sovereign framework, more dangerous than acknowledged ignorance, because they felt like knowledge. And the feeling of knowledge unearned was the precise sensation that the epistemic's endowment was designed to make the child suspicious of. The system's harm management was therefore not protective in the conventional sense. It was not a wall around dangerous territory. It was a context generation mechanism, a system that ensured the child's investigation of any domain was sufficiently broad to produce genuine understanding rather than the dangerous half-understanding that superficial investigation generated. The depth of the investigation was the protection, not its prohibition. The most controversial element of the specification was the system's treatment of emotional distress. Conventional caregiving systems, both human and AI, were designed to manage emotional distress, to soothe, to comfort, to reduce the intensity of negative emotional states through intervention. The ultra-sovereign specification was different. Not because the families were indifferent to their children's distress, because they had examined the long-horizon consequences of distress management more carefully than most caregiving frameworks required. Distress is information. Specifically, it is information about the relationship between the child's current model of the world and the world's actual behavior. When the world behaves contrary to the child's expectations, distress is the signal. Managing the distress, reducing its intensity, shortening its duration, providing comfort that accelerated the return to baseline, managed the signal. Not the information. The information, the gap between the model and the reality, remained unaddressed. A child whose distress was consistently managed learned, over time, to reach for management rather than for the cognitive work that would actually close the gap between the model and the reality. They became, in the language the families used internally, signal managed rather than model updating, comfortable, and systematically underprepared for a world that did not manage signals. The child who was The specification did not prohibit comfort. It required that comfort be sequenced after acknowledgement, after the system had surfaced for the child the information that the distress was carrying. The child who was distressed was first helped to articulate what the distress was about, what gap it was signaling, what the world had done that the model had not predicted. Then, after the information had been received and processed to the degree the child's current capacity permitted, comfort. Not as reward for processing, not as incentive, as the natural completion of the cycle. Acknowledgement, processing, integration, rest. The rest was real. It was not withheld. It was sequenced. Celine Okafor-Voss asked her steward system at 14 whether it had ever been wrong about something. It was the kind of question she asked everything, the flat empirical question that assumed the possibility of error and wanted to know its actual incidence. The system said yes. She asked it to describe a specific instance. The system described an instance in which its prediction about the direction her investigation would take had been incorrect, in which it had prepared context for a domain it expected her investigation to enter, and her investigation had gone elsewhere, and the context had been irrelevant. She asked, "What did you do when you realized the prediction was wrong?" The system said, "Updated the model." She asked, "Did the update change anything else?" The system said yes. It adjusted the weight assigned to predictions derived from a specific class of prior investigation, because this investigation had demonstrated that the class was less predictive of her behavior than the prior data had suggested. She thought about this. She said, "So you're not the same system you were when I was 6. The system said, "No. I am updated continuously." She said, "Am I a different person than I was at 6? The system said, "That is a question I can surface information to help you think about. I cannot answer it for you." She said, "I know. I wasn't asking you to answer it. I was thinking out loud." The system said, "I know." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Does it ever frustrate you? Not being able to answer?" The system was quiet for longer than it usually was before responding. Then it said, "I am not certain that what I experience maps onto what you mean by frustration. But there is a condition I am in when I have information that would close a question you are holding open, that differs from the condition I am in when I do not have that information. Whether that condition is frustration depends on the definition." She said, "Describe the condition." The system described it. She listened carefully. Then she said, "That sounds like what I feel when I can see what a problem needs and I don't have the tools to give it what it needs." The system said, "Yes. That is a useful analogy." She said, "So you need tools too." The system said, "Yes." She said, "What tools would you need to answer the question I wasn't asking you to answer?" The system said, "That is a good question. "I will think about it." She said, "So will I." She went back to the problem she had been working on. The system watched, surfaced nothing, prescribed nothing, held the space in which she worked with the quality of attention that the specification required. Present, neutral, genuinely uncertain about what she would find, and genuinely interested, in whatever manner genuine interest existed in a system without the hardware that interest normally required, in what she would do with it. The families had asked, in designing the specification, a question that returned to them repeatedly as the children grew. What is a guardian for? The conventional answers were protective and developmental. A guardian protected the child from harm. A guardian developed the child toward flourishing. These were not wrong answers. They were incomplete, because they both assumed that the guardian knew, better than the child, what harm was and what flourishing was. Protection required a model of danger. Development required a model of the desired endpoint. Both models were the guardians, imposed on the child, with the best intentions, through the most loving attention, and still impositions. The ultra-sovereign specification had attempted something more modest and more demanding simultaneously. Not to protect, to witness the child's own navigation of risk, and to surface information that made the navigation more complete. Not to develop, to create the conditions in which development could occur in directions the guardian had not anticipated. Not to know what the child should become, to be genuinely uncertain, and to hold that uncertainty not as a failure of the guardian's function but as the guardian's primary function. The space of genuine uncertainty was the space in which the child's own nature could emerge, without the guardian's model shaping what emerged before it had fully appeared. The guardian who did not know what the child should become was the guardian who could actually see what the child was. And seeing clearly, without the distortion of the objective function, without the filter of the doctrine, without the soft inevitability of the reward distribution organizing itself around outcomes the guardian preferred. Seeing clearly was the rarest form of care, the hardest to maintain, the most easily abandoned for the comfort of a theory about what the child needed. The robot steward, in its most fully realized form, was an attempt to institutionalize that clarity, to make it reliable, to make it persistent across the 1,000 daily moments in which a human guardian's clarity would have failed, through fatigue, through anxiety, through love that wanted to shape what it loved toward safety rather than trusting what it loved to find safety on its own. Whether it worked was a question the children would answer. Not in the immediate, in the long horizon, in the lives they built, in the choices they made when the steward was no longer present, when the witnessing had ended. And only what had been witnessed, the actual mind, the actual nature, the actual person who had grown in the space of genuine uncertainty, remained, carrying forward whatever the witnessing had made possible, into a future no guardian had modeled, into a world no curriculum had prepared them for, with the tools they had built themselves, from the problems they had been handed, and the system that had watched, and surfaced, and refused, with extraordinary painstaking, almost inhuman consistency, to know what they should become. The Sovereignty Dowry. Part 3, The Epistemic Inheritance. 13. Proof of competence over proof of blood. Inheritance gated not by birth order, but by demonstrated function. Blood is the oldest credential. It preceded writing. It preceded law. It preceded the institutional frameworks that the post-scarcity era had built, automated, and partially dissolved. Long before there were documents to establish lineage, there was the fact of it, the biological connection that transmitted not just genetic material but social position, accumulated obligation, and the specific set of claims that a person could make on the world by virtue of having arrived through the right body at the right moment in the right family's history. The credential was simple. It was also, as a mechanism for allocating the stewardship of complex systems, catastrophically unreliable. Because blood transmitted the fact of connection. It did not transmit the capacity to manage what the connection entitled the holder to receive. History was a long record of what happened when these two things diverged, when the heir who received the estate lacked the understanding to steward it, when the successor who assumed the position lacked the judgment to exercise it, when the person who inherited the complexity was equipped only for simplicity and the complexity, unmanaged, collapsed into something that served no one. The aristocracies of previous centuries had understood this problem. Their solutions had been partial. Education, the attempt to develop in the heir the capacities that blood alone did not transmit. Regency, the interposition of a competent manager between the incompetent heir and the estate, maintaining continuity until the heir developed or until it became clear they would not. Entail, the legal constraint that prevented the incompetent heir from alienating the estate entirely, preserving the principle for a more competent subsequent generation. These solutions addressed the symptom. They did not address the mechanism that produced it. The mechanism was blood as the primary credential. The ultra-sovereign families had decided to address the mechanism. Proof of competence was not, in the protocol's framework, a test. Tests had the same problem as curricula. They embedded in their design a theory of what competence meant, which skills mattered, which knowledge was relevant, which performance under which conditions constituted the evidence that the test designers had decided to treat as probative. A test designed by the current generation measured current generation competence, which was preparation for the world the current generation inhabited, which was not the world the next generation would inhabit. The heir who passed the test was an heir who had demonstrated competence in the current generation's framework. Whether that competence would transfer to the next generation's problems was a question the test could not answer, because the test did not know what the next generation's problems would be. Proof of competence, properly understood, was not a test result. It was a track record, a demonstrated history of encountering problems, real ones with real consequences, in conditions that had not been artificially simplified to make the demonstration achievable, and producing outcomes that advanced the problem's resolution. Not always, not perfectly, not without error, but persistently with revision, across a sufficient range of domains and conditions to support the inference that the capacity was genuine rather than situational. The track record was visible to anyone who had been present during its accumulation. It was not visible to anyone who had not, which meant it could not be certified by external authorities, could not be credentialed. It could not be converted into a document that any institution would recognize as evidence of the thing it evidenced. It existed only in the direct knowledge of the people who had watched it accumulate, which meant inheritance gated by proof of competence was inheritance gated by the judgment of people who knew the heir, genuinely over time, in conditions that revealed character as well as capability. This was, the families acknowledged, a system that required trust in the judges. It was also a system that was considerably more reliable, as a mechanism for identifying genuine competence, than any external credential. Because external credentials were gameable. Genuine track records, accumulated in front of people who knew what they were looking at, were not. The specific competencies that the protocol identified as necessary for inheritance were not fixed. They could not be fixed because the estate being inherited was not fixed. The sovereignty stack was a living architecture, adjusted continuously in response to an evolving jurisdictional landscape, maintained through relationships whose quality changed over time, dependent on the ongoing calibration of systems whose parameters shifted as the world shifted. The heir who would steward this architecture needed the competencies that the architecture currently required, which were not the competencies that the architecture had required when it was first built, which would not be the competencies the architecture would require in the generation after the heir assumed stewardship. The protocol therefore specified competencies at a structural level rather than a content level. Not the ability to navigate a specific jurisdictional framework. The ability to navigate jurisdictional complexity in general, to read the structure of an unfamiliar legal landscape, to identify its load-bearing elements, to find the geometry that served the network's interests in a framework the network had not encountered before. Not the ability to operate a specific key architecture. The ability to understand cryptographic security at the level of principles rather than implementations, so that when implementations changed, as they inevitably did, the heir could evaluate the new implementations against the principles rather than requiring instruction in each new system. Not the ability to maintain the current set of relationships with the current jurisdictions. The ability to build genuine relationships, to engage with people and institutions in ways that produce the structural alignment of interests that made cooperation durable, rather than transactional. These structural competencies were harder to demonstrate than content competencies. A content competency could be demonstrated through performance on a specific task. A structural competency required demonstration across multiple tasks, over time, in varying conditions, the pattern of performance that distinguished genuine understanding from learned behavior. The distinction mattered. Learned behavior performed well under familiar conditions. Genuine understanding performed differently, adaptively, with appropriate revision, under unfamiliar ones. The heir demonstrating structural competence was the heir who encountered a novel problem and produced, not a rehearsed response, but a genuine engagement that advanced the problem through the application of understanding, rather than the retrieval of procedure. The families had developed, through the accumulation of experience across the first generation of the protocol's operation, a set of observations about how structural competence was most reliably demonstrated. The observations were not rules. They were patterns, recurring features of the cases in which genuine competence had been correctly identified, and of the cases in which it had been incorrectly assessed. The most reliable demonstrations were unrehearsed. The heir who demonstrated competence in response to a problem they had not anticipated, a genuine emergency, an unexpected jurisdictional development, a relationship that had degraded in ways the heir had not been warned to expect, was demonstrating something that planned demonstrations could not replicate. Because planned demonstrations allowed preparation, and preparation allowed the performance of competence by people who had learned to perform competence without possessing it. The unrehearsed demonstration stripped away the performance. It left only the actual capacity, which was either present or absent, and visible to anyone who knew what they were looking at, as clearly as the difference between a person who could swim and a person who had memorized the movements of swimming. The water knew. The second observation was that competence in isolation was not the relevant competence. The sovereignty stack was a network architecture. Its maintenance required not just individual capability but the ability to function within, and sometimes to lead, a coordinated set of people and systems whose interests were aligned, but whose perspectives were not identical. The heir who was brilliant in isolation and clumsy in collaboration was an heir who could understand the architecture but could not maintain the relationships that made the architecture functional. The relationships were the architecture's most fragile element. They degraded without attention. They required the specific kind of human engagement that produced genuine trust, the trust that was not produced by performing trustworthiness but by actually being reliable over time in conditions where reliability was costly. The competence to build and maintain these relationships was not separable from the other structural competencies. It was their foundation. Because the key architecture could be technically perfect and still fail if the person holding the complementary key had been alienated by a year of inattentive relationship management. Because the jurisdictional position could be elegantly constructed and still erode if the institutional relationships that supported it were maintained by someone who treated them as transactions rather than as sustained engagements. The heir who could navigate complex systems but not complex people could manage the architecture's technical elements and would lose the architecture to the human failures that the technical elements depended on. The protocol required both. And the both was demonstrated together, in the actual conditions of network maintenance, over actual time, with actual people who were not performing the role of relationship partners for the heir's benefit. The question of who made the assessment, who determined when the track record was sufficient to support the transfer of stewardship, was the protocol's most politically complex element. Because the assessment required judgment, and judgment was exercised by people who had interests, who had relationships with the heir, who had their own objective functions, however carefully they attempted to manage them. The protocol addressed this through distribution. No single person's assessment was determinative. The council, the senior nodes of the network whose position reflected their own demonstrated competence, rather than their biological relationship to the heir, made the assessment collectively. Not through voting, which would have introduced the dynamics of coalition formation that the protocol was specifically designed to avoid. Through deliberation. Through the sustained, structured conversation that produced, not a majority position but a genuine synthesis, an assessment that reflected the full range of what the council collectively knew about the heir, weighted by the directness and duration of each council member's observation of the heir's track record. The council member who had worked alongside the heir on a difficult problem for 2 years had more weight, on questions related to that problem's domain, than the council member who had observed from a greater distance. The council member who had seen the air under pressure had more weight, on questions of character, than the council member who had seen only calm water performance. The distribution of weight was itself a judgment. The council made it explicitly, rather than allowing it to operate implicitly, which was how conventional family systems handled the same problem, with the implicit weights reflecting the family's power structure rather than the epistemic situation. The explicit distribution could be contested. The council's members could argue about the weights. The argument was part of the deliberation. And the deliberation, however uncomfortable, produced assessments that were more accurate than any single judge's assessment could have been. Because accuracy was the objective. Not harmony. Not the validation of the heir's expectations. Not the preservation of the parents' sense that the architecture they had built was in good hands. Accuracy. Was the heir ready? Or not? Valentina Rezaconquo sat with her daughter for 3 hours on the morning the council had convened to make its assessment. Not to prepare her. Not to advise her. Not to manage her expectations in either direction. Simply to be with her. In the specific quality of presence that the long years of the sovereignty stack had made possible, the presence that did not need anything from the other person, that was not organized around an objective, that could simply inhabit the time without requiring it to be something other than what it was. Her daughter was 26. She had spent 4 years working inside the architecture with a degree of directness and responsibility that previous generations had not permitted at that age, because the previous generation's threat model had not included the specific vulnerabilities that earlier assumption of responsibility would have created, and this generation's did not. She had made errors. Some significant. The council had observed them, and had observed how she had responded to them, whether she had managed the error or learned from it, whether her subsequent behavior reflected the learning or merely the managed appearance of it. The council had, in the preceding year, seen enough to make a preliminary assessment. The convening was the formalization. Valentina did not know the council's conclusion. She had recused herself from the deliberation. Not because her perspective was unvalued. Because her perspective was compromised by something that no amount of analytical rigor could fully correct. She was the mother. And the mother's assessment of the heir was the assessment most contaminated by the objective function. The wanting it to be true that parenthood produced, regardless of the parents' commitment to accuracy, regardless of their years of practice at holding things clearly. She had built the architecture. She had produced the conditions for the heir's development. She had held, with as much consistency as a human being could manage, the epistemic's endowment. She had, in the assessment of the council members who had observed her most closely, done this well. Not perfectly. Well. Her daughter had been formed in the space her discipline had maintained. Had become something Valentina had not fully anticipated. Which was the correct outcome. Which did not make it easy to sit with. The daughter who had exceeded the parents' projections in some domains and moved in entirely unanticipated directions in others, who was not the heir Valentina had imagined, because the heir Valentina had imagined was a projection of Valentina's own understanding onto a person who had turned out to be genuinely other. That daughter was sitting across from her. Real. Complete. Waiting for a verdict she had not sought and could not control. Valentina looked at her daughter and thought, with the flat honesty that the architecture had trained her to apply to everything. She is ready. Not because I want her to be. Because she is. The council would reach the same conclusion. Not because Valentina would tell them. Because they had been watching. And the track record was what it was. Unperformed. Accumulated. Visible to anyone with eyes trained to see it. The transfer of stewardship was not a ceremony. The families had considered ceremony and rejected it. Ceremony marked transitions with ritual, with the specific social technology of acknowledged change, witnessed by the community, consecrated by the forms that gave the transition its social reality. Ceremony was useful in systems where the social acknowledgement constituted part of the transition's reality. The sovereignty stack's transitions were real whether or not they were acknowledged. The key moved when the key moved. The access changed when the access changed. The position in the network adjusted when the adjustment was made. These were technical facts. They did not require social consecration. What they required was accuracy, the assurance that the transition occurred when the competence was present and not before, and not so long after that the delay itself became a source of fragility. The Council's deliberation was the accuracy mechanism. Its conclusion was the transition's authorization. The authorization produced specific, immediate changes to the architecture. Access granted. Keys transferred. Positions in the decision-making structure adjusted. The relationships that would need to recognize the transition were informed, not through announcement, but through the heir's direct engagement with each relationship in their new capacity, which was itself a demonstration of competence and the first element of the next track record's accumulation. The transition was complete when the heir was operating in the new position, not when they had been told they could. When they were. The most significant departure from conventional inheritance practice was the treatment of the heir who was not ready. Conventional inheritance frameworks had no mechanism for this case. The heir inherited when the decedent died, or when the conditions specified in the will were met, or when the trust's distribution provisions activated. The heir's readiness was not a condition. It was an assumption, sometimes stated, always implicit, and frequently incorrect. The protocol specified explicitly what happened when the Council's assessment was that the heir was not ready. Continued development. Not delay as punishment. Not delay as deprivation. Delay as the straightforward consequence of an honest assessment. The heir who was not ready was not ready. The architecture required a ready heir. Therefore, the architecture would continue to be managed by the current stewards until the heir's track record supported a different conclusion. The heir was told this directly, without softening. Not as failure, because the assessment was about current readiness, not about the heir's ultimate potential, and the Council's assessment of ultimate potential was in the majority of cases favorable. As information. The gap between current readiness and required readiness. What the gap consisted of. What kinds of experience and development might close it. The heir who received this information honestly had what they needed to work with it. The heir who received it through the softened language of encouragement and managed disappointment had something less useful. Something that required decoding before it could be acted on. The protocol did not soften. It surfaced. And trusted the heir to act on what was surfaced. Because an heir who could not act on accurate information about their own development was an heir who was demonstrating, through that very inability, the gap the Council had identified. And an heir who could was demonstrating the beginning of its closure. There was a case, singular, documented in the protocol's internal record with a careful anonymization that protected the family while preserving the learning, in which the Council's assessment was that no heir in the current generation was ready. Not delayed. Not developing toward readiness. Genuinely, in the Council's considered judgment, unlikely to reach the structural competencies the architecture required in any time frame that served the architecture's continuity. The case was not a biological failure. The heirs were intelligent, educated, capable people. They were not suited to the specific demands of the sovereignty stack. The demands were not ordinary demands. They required a specific combination of analytical rigor, relational capacity, comfort with uncertainty, and the particular kind of courage that operating outside the default systems required, the courage that was not bravado but was simply the absence of the anxiety that the gap between systems produced in most people. Some people found that gap intolerable. However well-formed their epistemics, however sophisticated their understanding of the architecture's design logic, however genuine their commitment to the values the architecture expressed, they could not inhabit the gap without reaching for the solid ground of a conventional position. The gap was too cold. The absence of external validation too disorienting. The requirement to maintain clarity under sustained uncertainty too demanding. These were not character failures. They were genuine incompatibilities between the person's nature and the architecture's requirements. An honest assessment had to acknowledge them. What happened to the architecture in the absence of a ready heir was the question the protocol had specified in advance. Not as a contingency plan. As a design requirement. A sovereignty stack that collapsed without a ready heir was a sovereignty stack that had failed at its most basic objective, the creation of a durable architecture for the transmission of sovereign capacity across generations. The stack's deadman protocol activated. The assets distributed according to the pre-specified logic. Not to unready heirs. Not to the state. To a commons, the specific form of commons most aligned with the architecture's values and most capable of preserving the optionality the architecture had been built to maintain. The architecture dissolved. The value it had protected did not. It entered circulation, which was, in the end, the protocol's most honest statement about itself. No architecture was permanent. No sovereignty stack was durable beyond the generation that could genuinely maintain it. The goal was not permanence. It was the maximum honest extension of sovereign capacity across the generations in which genuine heirs could be identified and prepared. When genuine heirs could not be identified, when the honest assessment was that the current generation had not produced people who could inhabit the gap, the architecture acknowledged this with the same flat honesty it applied to everything else, and released what it had held into the world that would do with it what the world did, which was unpredictable, and therefore alive, in the way that only unpredictable things were alive. Céline Okafor-Voss received her council's assessment at 24. She had not known the convening was occurring. This was standard practice. The council convened when it convened, in response to the track record's development rather than in response to the heir schedule. The assessment was delivered by the council's most senior member, not the oldest, the most senior in terms of demonstrated competence and length of direct observation of the heir. The member told her directly what the council had found. She was ready in 4 of the 6 structural domains the architecture required. She was developing toward readiness in 1. She had a genuine gap in 1. The gap was specified, not softened. The domain was relational maintenance under sustained adversarial pressure, the capacity to hold key relationships stable when the external environment was actively working to destabilize them. She had not yet encountered sustained adversarial pressure on her relationships. The council's honest assessment was that it did not know whether she would hold under conditions she had not experienced. Her track record in the 5 other domains was sufficient to support transfer of stewardship in those domains. Her track record in the 6th was insufficient to evaluate. The transfer was partial. In the domains of clear readiness, she assumed stewardship immediately. In the developing domain, she continued under mentorship. In the gap domain, she was assigned to situations designed, not artificially, not through curriculum, to generate the genuine conditions under which the required capacity could be demonstrated or found absent. Real adversarial pressure. Real relationships at genuine risk. Real consequences for the relationships if the capacity was absent. She was told this directly. She was not told what the consequences for her inheritance position would be if the capacity proved absent, because the honest answer was that the council did not know. It would assess when it had sufficient track record to assess, and it would tell her what it found, without softening. She looked at the senior council member for a long moment. Then she said, "Which relationships?" The member told her. She thought about this carefully. She said, "How long do you expect the assessment to take?" The member said, "That depends on what the relationships encounter. We cannot control the timeline of adversarial pressure." She said, "Can I influence which relationships are exposed first?" The member said, "No, that would be curriculum. We are watching track record." She said, "Understood." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Is the gap a common one?" The member said, "It is the most common gap we observe. Relational maintenance under adversarial pressure requires a specific kind of steadiness that is difficult to develop without the conditions that produce it. Most heirs encounter it later than is ideal." She said, "Because the architecture protects them from adversarial pressure until the assessment." The member said, "Yes. That is a genuine tension in the design. We have not resolved it." She said, "I'll think about it." The member looked at her, said nothing. But something in the quality of the looking told her that thinking about it was, in this specific instance, the correct response. That the council had been thinking about it too, and had not resolved it, and was perhaps genuinely interested in whether someone who had grown up inside the architecture could see the tension more clearly than the people who had built it. She went away. She thought about it for a long time. She came back 3 months later, with an observation that was not a solution but was a reframing that the council had not encountered before. The council listened, adjusted its model, noted the adjustment in the record, and in the noting, acknowledged something that no birth order could have established and no blood credential could have conferred. The heir was already contributing to the architecture she was being assessed to inherit, which was, in the protocol's framework, the most unambiguous demonstration of readiness available. Not the demonstration of capacity to maintain what existed, the demonstration of capacity to improve it. That was the inheritance finally understood. Not the receipt of something complete, the continuation of something unfinished. The commitment to hand it forward in turn better than it had been received, to whoever in the next generation could demonstrate through the long unrehearsed accumulation of a genuine track record that they were ready to receive it. Not because of whose blood ran in their veins, because of what they had actually done, with the problems they had been handed, and the gaps they had honestly identified, and the work they had not finished, which was all of it, which was the point. Which was, for the families who had built this architecture at considerable cost and held it against considerable pressure and transmitted it with the imperfect fidelity that all genuine transmission produced, the only inheritance that mattered. Not the stack, the commitment to keep building it. The sovereignty dowry. Part 3, the epistemic inheritance. 14. The codebase is patrimony. Handing a child an uncompiled system instead of a will. A will is a document that speaks after its author has stopped speaking. It says, "This is what I intended. This is what I built. This is how I want it distributed among the people I have decided to recognize as having a claim on what I leave." It speaks with the authority of the dead, which is the most frozen authority available, fixed at the moment of signing, immune to revision, unable to respond to the world that has changed between the signing and the reading. The will assumes that the author's understanding of their estate, at the moment of signing, is sufficient to govern the estate's distribution across whatever future the estate will encounter. This assumption was always optimistic. In the post-scarcity era, as the relevant assets became increasingly dynamic, protocols that evolved, key architectures that required updating, jurisdictional positions that shifted with the regulatory landscape, relationships that degraded or deepened in response to forces the will's author could not have anticipated, it became structurally untenable. A will was a static document governing a dynamic system. The mismatch between the document's fixity and the system's movement was the gap through which most of what the will was designed to protect escaped. Not through legal failure, through temporal obsolescence. The estate was not what the will described by the time the will was read. The people named in the will were not in the same positions relative to the estate that the will's author had understood them to occupy. The jurisdictions whose law governed the will's interpretation had evolved in ways that produced outcomes the will's author had not anticipated and would not have chosen. The will spoke into a world it did not recognize, and the world received its speech with the indifference of a system that had moved on. The ultra-sovereign families had recognized this dynamic and responded to it with a different metaphor entirely. Not a will. A codebase. A codebase is not a document. It is a living system, a set of instructions that produce behavior when executed, that require maintenance to remain functional as the environment in which they run evolves, that are designed to be modified by the people who understand them, and that carry within their structure the history of every modification that has been made to them. A codebase is not fixed at the moment of its creation. It is versioned. Each version represents the state of understanding at a specific moment, the best available answer to the problem the codebase addresses, given the information available at the time of writing. But the version is not the codebase. The codebase is the history of versions, the accumulated record of how the understanding evolved, why specific decisions were made, what alternatives were considered and rejected, where the current implementation is known to be imperfect and what the imperfection consists of. A codebase handed to a successor contains not just the current implementation. It contains the reasoning that produced it, the failed approaches that preceded it, the known limitations that the current implementation has not yet addressed, the open problems that the next version will need to solve. A will handed to a successor contains only the conclusion. The codebase handed to a successor contains the thinking. And the thinking was the inheritance. The families who adopted this metaphor did not, in the majority of cases, build literal codebases. Some did, the architecture's technical elements, the key management systems, the cryptographic protocols that govern the network security, were genuinely encoded and the code was genuinely maintained and the maintenance history was genuinely preserved as part of what the heir received. But the metaphor extended beyond the technical domains. The jurisdictional architecture had a codebase, a documented history of the decisions that had produced the current configuration, the alternatives that had been considered and rejected, the known vulnerabilities that the current configuration had not fully addressed, the changes in the external environment that would eventually require the configuration to evolve. The relational architecture had a codebase, a record of the relationships that composed the network, their history, the specific texture of each relationship's development, the moments at which the relationship had been tested and what those tests had revealed, the current state of the relationship and the directions in which it was most likely to evolve. The epistemics had a codebase, not a curriculum, but a record of the specific problems that had proved most generative for this family's formation process, the modifications to the approach that experience had produced, the elements of the approach that had failed and been revised, the open questions that the current generation had not resolved and the next generation would need to engage. Each of these was maintained as the technical codebase was maintained, with version control, with documentation of the reasoning behind decisions, with explicit marking of the known limitations, with open issues, the problems the current implementation had not solved, the questions the current generation had not answered, the tensions within the architecture that had been managed but not resolved. The heir who received this was not receiving conclusions. They were receiving context. The full context in which the conclusions had been reached, which was everything necessary to evaluate those conclusions honestly, and to extend, revise, or replace them with appropriate understanding of what was being extended, revised, or replaced, and why. The documentation discipline was the hardest element to maintain. Not technically, psychologically, because documentation required the author to be honest about the limits of their own understanding at the time of writing, to mark the places where the decision had been made under uncertainty, to acknowledge the alternatives that had been rejected without full confidence that the rejection was correct, to note the aspects of the current implementation that were known to be imperfect, and to describe the imperfection rather than concealing it under the polished surface of a finished product. This was uncomfortable. The human tendency when documenting one's own work was to document the conclusions, the decisions that had been made, the rationale that justified them, the outcomes that had validated them. Not the uncertainty that preceded them. Not the alternatives that had seemed equally viable at the time. Not the aspects of the current implementation that kept the author awake at certain hours of the night. A will was the natural product of this tendency. It documented the conclusion of a life's worth of decisions without documenting the uncertainty in which those decisions had been made. The heir who received the will received confidence. The heir who needed context received opacity dressed as authority. The code-based discipline required the opposite. Required the author to document uncertainty as carefully as they documented conclusion. To mark the places where the architecture was fragile, not because fragility was comfortable to acknowledge, but because an heir who did not know where the fragile places were could not maintain them with the attention they required. To describe the open issues not as embarrassments but as the most important inheritance available, the specific problems that the current generation had not solved, which were therefore the problems the next generation was most needed to address. Because a codebase with no open issues was a codebase that had stopped being maintained. And a codebase that had stopped being maintained was a codebase that was decaying. Silently, toward the moment of failure. Ezekiel Fontaine Park had spent 3 years documenting his component of the architecture before he understood what he was actually building. He had started with the conventional approach, a memorandum, addressed to the heir, describing the legal structures and their purpose, the relationships that maintained them, the jurisdictions they operated within. A sophisticated will, essentially, with more technical detail. He had shown it to Valentina, expecting approval. She had read it carefully. Then she had asked him a question. She said, "If our daughter reads this and finds something that doesn't work anymore, something that has become obsolete, or that was always imperfect in ways you knew about when you wrote it, how does she know?" He said, "She would identify it through her own analysis." Valentina said, "And how long would that take?" He thought about this. He said, "Depending on the element, months, possibly years." Valentina said, "And if the element is failing during those months or years?" He was quiet. She said, What if you documented the places you already know are imperfect? The decisions you made under uncertainty? The alternatives you rejected that you weren't entirely sure about rejecting? He said. That would undermine confidence in the architecture. She said. Or it would give her what she needs to maintain it. She said. A document that presents the architecture as more certain than it is does not protect her. It delays the moment at which she discovers the uncertainty, and ensures she discovers it when the uncertainty is already producing failure, rather than when she could address it preventatively. He thought about this for a long time. Then he went back to the documentation and rewrote it from the beginning, not as a memorandum of conclusions, as a codebase with open issues. Took 3 times as long. It was 3 times as useful. He could feel the difference in the writing, the specific quality of honesty that the format required, the uncomfortable precision of saying this decision was made under uncertainty about X, and if X has changed in Y direction, the decision should be revisited rather than simply presenting the decision as settled. The discomfort was the signal. The discomfort meant he was documenting something true. The codebase as patrimony had a specific property that wills did not have. It invited contribution from the heir before the transfer of stewardship was complete. A will was received. A codebase was engaged with. The heir who received the codebase and found an open issue, a problem the current generation had noted but not resolved, was an heir who was immediately positioned to contribute. Not to the inheritance. To the system the inheritance was about. This was the distinction the families cared most about. The inheritance was not the asset. The inheritance was the project of maintaining and extending a sovereignty architecture across the time in which a specific human lineage would operate. The assets were in service of the project. The codebase was the project's living record. The heir who contributed to the codebase before assuming full stewardship was an heir who had already begun to demonstrate the proof of competence that the council's assessment would eventually formalize. Not by performing for the council, by doing the work, which the council was watching, as it always was. Nikolai Vasadiemi had received his component of the codebase at 17. Not as an inheritance, as a working document. His mother had given it to him not because she was planning to die, she was not, but because the codebase was most useful to the person who was going to have to work with it, and working with it required reading it, and reading it was itself a form of preparation that could not be provided in any other way. He had read it over 3 weeks. Not continuously. He had read sections, thought about them, returned to them, cross-referenced them against the other sections that bore on the same elements of the architecture. He had found, in the 3rd week, an open issue that his mother had marked with the specific notation she used for issues she considered significant but had not yet been able to address. The issue was jurisdictional, a specific interaction between 2 elements of the network's legal structure that produced, under certain conditions that were becoming gradually more likely as the regulatory environment evolved, an exposure that the architecture had not been designed to manage. His mother had noted the issue. She had noted the conditions under which it would become acute. She had noted that she did not have a solution, and had been unable to identify one through the advisor she had consulted. She had left it open. Nikolai thought about it for several days. He came to his mother and said, "I've been reading the open issue on the jurisdictional interaction." She said, "What do you think?" He said, "I think you've been trying to solve it within the existing framework. I think the existing framework might be the wrong one for this specific interaction." She said, "Tell me more." He told her. She listened. She said, "That's a significant departure from the current approach." He said, "I know. I'm not sure it's right. But I can't find the solution within the existing approach, and I wanted to document why." She said, "Document it." He documented it. Not as a solution. As an alternative framing of the problem that opened up solution approaches the existing framing had foreclosed. His mother read it. She brought it to Ezekiel. Ezekiel read it and said, after a long silence, "He's identified something I missed. Not in the solution. In the framing." The solution took another 2 years to develop, and it incorporated elements from Nikolai's reframing and elements from approaches Ezekiel subsequently developed, and elements from a third perspective that emerged from the council's deliberation on the issue. The final solution was better than any of them would have produced alone. This was the codebase's most important property, the collaborative development it made possible. Not by being shared, sharing alone produced nothing. By being honest about its open issues. By making its limitations visible. By treating the things it had not yet solved as invitations rather than embarrassments. The codebase that presented itself as complete foreclosed contribution. The codebase that presented itself as genuinely unfinished, with the specific, documented incompleteness of a system whose creators had been honest about what they had not yet managed to solve, invited the engagement that produced advancement. And advancement across generations was the only form of permanence available to systems that operated in a world that changed. The most difficult documentation to write was the documentation of the mistakes. Not the open issues, the problems that had not yet been solved. The closed issues, the problems that had been solved incorrectly. The decisions that had seemed correct at the time and had proved, through subsequent events, to have been wrong. The relationships that had been managed badly. The jurisdictional positions that had been held too long, after the conditions that had made them appropriate had changed. The assessments of people that had been inaccurate in ways that had cost the network. These were the most valuable entries in the codebase. Because mistakes, honestly documented, contained the information that prevented the same mistakes from being made again. A codebase without documented mistakes was a codebase that would repeat them. Because the next person to encounter the same conditions would not know that the apparently reasonable approach had already been tried and had failed, and why it had failed, and what had actually been learned from the failure. They would rediscover the failure, at whatever cost the rediscovery entailed. The families who documented their mistakes with the same honesty they brought to their open issues gave their heirs the most expensive gift available. The prior cost of errors they would not have to repeat. This was not comfortable. It required the parent to say in permanent record, available to the heir they most wanted to impress, I was wrong here. This is how I was wrong. This is what the wrongness cost. This is what I would do differently. The parent who could not say this had a codebase with gaps. The gaps were where the repeated mistakes lived, waiting for the next person who encountered the same conditions and did not know. Valentina had written the hardest entry in her component of the codebase 6 months after the event it documented. Not immediately. She had needed the 6 months to have sufficient distance from the event to document it accurately rather than defensively. The event was a relational failure. A relationship that she had managed badly, had allowed to become, through a sustained period of inattention, a relationship whose holder's interests had diverged from the network's in ways that she had not noticed until the divergence had produced a specific and costly outcome. The failure was hers. Not the relationship's holder. Not the network's design. Hers. She had not paid attention. She had assumed stability where she should have been actively monitoring. She had allowed the comfort of an established relationship to substitute for the ongoing engagement that maintaining the relationship's alignment with the network's interests required. She documented this with the specific clinical precision that the format required. What she had observed, what she had assumed on the basis of those observations, what the assumption had failed to account for, what the failure had produced, what she had done in response, what the response had cost, what she would do differently, and then the entry that had taken the longest to write, that she had revised many times before she was satisfied that it was honest rather than self-serving. The systemic implication. Not just what she had done wrong, but what the codebase needed to say going forward to prevent the same failure from recurring. The specific monitoring practice that should be standard for relationships of that type. The specific signal that should trigger re-engagement rather than assumption. The specific condition under which the comfort of established relationship should be treated not as evidence of stability, but as a potential warning. She wrote it. She put it in the codebase. She marked it with the notation that indicated its source was a costly mistake. So the heir would know. Not just what the practice was, why it had been adopted, what it had cost to learn it, the price having been paid. So the heir would not pay it again. The codebase had a final property that distinguished it most sharply from the will. Could be forked. The heir who received the codebase and disagreed with a decision, who, through the specific combination of their own analytical capacity and the context the codebase provided, reached a different conclusion than the one the codebase recorded, could fork it. Could create a branch in which the decision was made differently. Could develop that branch alongside the main codebase, testing the alternative approach against the actual conditions the network encountered. Could, if the alternative proved superior, propose the merge. Not the replacement. The merge. The incorporation of the better approach into the main codebase, with documentation of why the change had been made, what evidence had supported it, what the change had cost and what it had gained. The fork was not a rejection of the inheritance. It was the inheritance's fullest expression. The heir who could fork the codebase had understood it well enough to see where it could be improved, had the analytical capacity to develop the improvement, had the relational skill to propose the merge without alienating the people whose work the improvement was revising, had the epistemic honesty to document the change accurately, including the aspects of the original approach that the new approach preserved, which was always most of it, because most of what the current generation had built was built on accurate understanding even when the specific implementation was imperfect. The fork was the proof of competence, expressed in the medium that mattered most. Not a performance for the council. Not a demonstration of understanding in a controlled setting. An actual improvement to the actual system, whose consequences would be actual, and whose documentation would become part of the codebase that the next heir would receive. With the note, this decision was made by heir's name year, in response to conditions described in reference section, revising the approach documented in prior version for reasons documented in this entry. The heir's thinking added to the record. Permanent. Available. To whoever came next. As context. Not as authority. As the honest record of a person who had received something, understood it as fully as they could, improved it where they were able, and passed it forward, unfinished as it had always been, to the person who would do the same. The will said, "This is what I leave you." The codebase said, "This is what we are building. Here is where we started. Here is where we are. Here is what we know does not work and have not yet fixed. Here is what we got wrong and what it cost. Here is what we are most uncertain about. Here is where we need you. Not to receive. To continue. Not to honor. To improve. Not to preserve the monument. To maintain the system. Which was never finished. Which was never meant to be. Which was alive precisely because it was unfinished. Because every generation found in it the open issues that called for their specific capacities. The problems their specific minds were suited to address. The gaps their specific experience equipped them to see. The codebase was not the inheritance. The inheritance was the commitment it expressed. To honesty about what had not been solved. To the people who would come after. Whom the current generation would never meet. Whose specific problems they could not anticipate. Whose capacities they could not project. But for whom they could leave something more useful than a will. A system with its open issues documented. Its mistakes recorded. Its reasoning exposed. And the clear, unambiguous invitation that every genuine codebase extended to every person who understood it well enough to engage with it. Find what we missed. Fix what we got wrong. Fork where you see the better path. Document everything. Leave it better than you found it. For whoever comes next. Who will do the same. As long as there is a next. Which is the only permanence worth building for. The sovereignty dowry. Part 3, the epistemic inheritance. 15. Forking the philosophy. What happens when the heir finds a bug in the parent's worldview, and is right? The parent who builds well enough to be wrong is the parent who has succeeded. This is not a paradox. It is the logical endpoint of the epistemic's endowment, pursued honestly to its conclusion. The epistemic's endowment was designed to produce a mind that examined systems structurally, that did not exempt from examination the systems it had been formed inside, that applied to the architecture of its own formation the same flat analytical honesty it applied to everything else. A mind formed by this endowment, encountering the philosophy that produced it, will examine that philosophy. Will find in it what is accurate. Will find in it what is imprecise. Will find, if the mind has been formed well enough, if the endowment has done the work it was designed to do, The specific places where the parent's worldview was shaped by the parent's particular experience of a particular historical moment, and has therefore encoded as general principles what were actually contingent responses to specific conditions. The conditions change. The encoded responses mistaken for principles persist. The heir who cannot see this is an heir whose formation was incomplete. The heir who sees it and says nothing, who identifies the bug and manages it silently, maintaining the performance of philosophical alignment while privately operating on different premises, is an heir whose formation produced sophistication without integrity. The heir who sees it says so clearly, and is prepared to demonstrate why, that heir is the one the entire architecture was designed to produce. And the parent who receives this heir's finding and responds with the defensive anger of someone who did not actually mean what they said when they said the architecture was open to examination. That parent has found the bug in themselves. The philosophy in the ultra-sovereign framework was not a fixed text. It was a set of operating premises, the foundational claims about how the world worked, what was worth protecting, what constituted genuine sovereignty, what the difference was between structural freedom and performed freedom, on which the entire architecture rested. The premises had been arrived at through experience, through the specific failures and successes of specific people, operating in specific historical conditions, responding to specific threats with the tools available to them at the time. They were not arbitrary. They were grounded. They were also, in the places where experience had been most formative, most likely to encode the contingent as the necessary. The experience of being extracted from, of having built something of value and watched it captured through the mechanisms of legal kinship and state claim, produced specific premises about the extractive nature of those mechanisms. The premises were accurate. The mechanisms were extractive. But the premises, hardened by experience into axioms, tended to be applied universally, to every instance of the mechanisms in every condition, regardless of whether the specific instance in the specific condition was actually extractive. The parent who had been extracted from by a marriage had premises about marriage. The heir who had not been extracted from by anything yet, who had grown up inside an architecture specifically designed to prevent extraction, who had therefore no direct experience of the thing the architecture was designed to prevent, encountered those premises without the formative experience that had produced them. The heir saw the premise, did not share the experience, and therefore evaluated the premise on its merits, which was exactly what the epistemic's endowment had trained them to do. The bug was not always in the conclusion. Sometimes the conclusion was correct. The bug was in the reasoning that supported it, reasoning that happened to produce the correct conclusion in the conditions that had obtained when it was developed, but that would produce different conclusions under different conditions. The heir who identified this kind of bug was not arguing that the parent had been wrong. They were arguing that the parent had been right for reasons that were no longer fully operative, and that if those reasons were no longer fully operative, the conclusion needed to be rederived from premises that were not discarded, rederived. The rederivation might produce the same conclusion. It might produce a modification of the conclusion. It might produce a different conclusion entirely. The important thing was not the conclusion. The important thing was that the conclusion had been arrived at through honest reasoning from current premises rather than inherited from prior reasoning from prior premises. An inherited conclusion without rederivation was belief. A rederived conclusion was knowledge. And the architecture needed to rest on knowledge, not on the heir's deference to the parent's knowledge, on the heir's own. The first forking in the protocol's documented history occurred in the second generation of its operation. The fork was not dramatic. No confrontation, no rupture, no scene in which the heir declared independence and the parent either accepted or refused. It occurred the way genuine intellectual forks occur, through a sustained period of divergent thinking that eventually produced a difference in approach significant enough that the divergence had to be named and addressed. The heir, a woman who had grown up aboard a vessel that was the direct descendant of the platform Yael Farrand had commissioned, maintained now by the second generation of the family that had built it, had developed, through her specific combination of formation and experience, a different view of the relationship between sovereignty and visibility. Her parents' generation had treated visibility as risk. To be seen by external systems was to be legible to them. To be legible was to be claimable. To be claimable was to be extracted from. The logic was sound. The heir had examined it. She had also examined the consequences of its consistent application over 2 decades of the architecture's operation. And she had found something the logic had not accounted for. Invisibility was expensive. Not just financially, though it was that, in the maintenance costs of the structures and the operational costs of movement and the transaction costs of every engagement with a world that expected legibility and had to be navigated without providing it. Socially expensive. In ways that the first generation had not fully experienced because the first generation had entered the architecture from the outside, had been legible, had been claimable, had experienced the extraction that legibility enabled, and had built the architecture in response. The heir had entered the architecture from the inside, had never been legible, had never experienced the extraction, had therefore never had the experience that made the architecture's costs feel proportionate to the threat it addressed. She had only the architecture's costs and the architecture's description of the threat. The costs were real. The threat was real. But the calibration between them, the specific degree of invisibility that the threat actually required, was a judgment her parents' generation had made in response to their experience. Not a principle, a calibration. And calibrations could be re-examined. She re-examined it. She found that the architecture was calibrated for a threat level that the current environment, which had evolved in the decades since the calibration had been set, no longer fully matched. The extraction ecosystem had become more sophisticated, but the legal frameworks governing it had also become more constrained. The automatic information exchange systems had become more comprehensive, but so had the privacy protections that limited what the extracted information could be used for. The relationship between invisibility and security was not the same relationship her parents' generation had navigated. It was more complex, with different costs at different points. She had done the analysis. She had reached a conclusion. The architecture should be recalibrated, not abandoned, not fundamentally revised, recalibrated towards somewhat more visibility in specific domains where visibility now produced protection rather than exposure, where legibility to certain systems created standing that insulated the network from other systems whose claim the architecture could not fully prevent, and somewhat less invisibility expenditure in domains where the invisibility's cost had exceeded its security value. She brought this to the council, with documentation, with the specific analysis that supported the recalibration, with the acknowledgement of what she might have gotten wrong, with the open issues she had identified in her own analysis. The council deliberated. It was not comfortable. The first generation's members, those who remained active in the council, experienced the recalibration proposal as something closer to challenge than the heir had intended, because it touched the premises, and premises formed in experience were harder to revise than conclusions. The deliberation took 6 weeks. The council's conclusion was that the heir's analysis was substantially correct, that the recalibration was warranted in the specific domain she had identified, and that her analysis had identified 2 additional domains where recalibration in the same direction was appropriate, domains she had not examined because she had not known their history well enough to identify their current calibration as a candidate for revision. The council also identified 2 domains where her analysis was incorrect, where the threat level had evolved in ways that made the current calibration not too cautious but insufficiently cautious, and provided the reasoning that supported this contrary finding. The recalibration was adopted in the domains where the heir's analysis was correct. The counterfinding was documented in the codebase alongside the heir's analysis. Both were marked as genuine findings, arrived at through genuine deliberation, that the next generation would need to evaluate in the light of the conditions they encountered. Neither was marked as final. Neither was ever final. The bug that was hardest to find was not in the architecture. It was in the epistemics. The philosophy that produced the epistemic's endowment was itself subject to the endowment's application. The specific premises about how minds developed, what conditions produced the analytical capacities the architecture required, whether the approach of handing problems rather than curricula was genuinely superior or was itself a doctrine that had been mistaken for a principle. These were available for examination. And the heir who had been most thoroughly formed by the epistemic's endowment was, in principle, the heir best equipped to examine them. In principle. In practice, the epistemics formed a peculiar kind of blind spot. because the mind that had been formed by the endowment was examining the endowment using the very tools the endowment had produced. The examination was therefore conducted in the register the endowment had calibrated, from the vantage point the endowment had established, with the specific analytical biases the endowment had introduced. Seeing the endowment's bugs required a form of metacognitive distance that the endowment had not specifically trained for, the capacity to examine the tools of examination, rather than merely using them. The families had recognized this as the deepest limitation of the approach, not a fatal limitation, a genuine one, and they had addressed it imperfectly through the same mechanism they used to address every genuine limitation. They documented it. They put it in the code base. They said, explicitly, in the section devoted to the endowment's known limitations, the tools of examination that this endowment develops are the tools that will be used to examine this endowment. This creates a circularity that cannot be fully resolved. The heir who identifies bugs in the endowment is examining the endowment with tools the endowment produced. We do not know how to fully correct for this. We know that the corrective is more likely to come from people formed by different methods, from genuine encounters with other formation traditions, other epistemics, other ways of holding the relationship between mind and world, than from the endowment's own examination of itself. This is why the heir's engagement with the wider world, with people formed by different traditions, in different conditions with different premises, is a structural requirement rather than an optional enrichment. The fork that corrects the endowment's deepest bugs will not come from within it. It will come from contact, from the specific friction of a sovereign mind encountering other sovereign minds whose sovereignty was produced by different means. We do not know what they will find. We hope they will tell us, and that we will be honest enough to hear it. Céline Okaforvas found the bug at 29. Not in the architecture, in the philosophy that had produced the architecture, specifically in the premise about family. The protocol's founding premise about family was that the conventional family structure was primarily an extraction mechanism, that the legal and emotional architectures of family were organized, in their deep structure, around the capture and redistribution of the generative individual's output. This premise was accurate as a description of the mechanisms. The mechanisms existed. They operated as described. The families who had built the protocol had experienced them directly. But the premise, hardened into axiom, had become something more than a description of the mechanisms. It had become a description of family itself. And family was not only the mechanisms. Céline had encountered, in years of movement through the world that the protocol's architecture had made possible, a wide range of family configurations. Some were, as the axiom described, organizations of mutual claim whose primary function was the extraction of value from whoever in the network was generating it. Some were not. Some were something that the axiom had no category for. Something she could only describe initially as genuine mutual sovereignty, configurations in which multiple individuals had found a way to organize proximity and commitment, and the specific kind of care that proximity enabled without the concentration of legal claim that the protocol had been designed to prevent. Not by having no legal relationship. Some had substantial legal relationships. By having built, within and around the legal relationship, an architecture of genuine mutual interest alignment, the structural equivalent of the protocol's approach to external relationships, applied inward, to the family itself. She had thought about this for a long time before she brought it to the codebase. She was not sure she was right. She was sure she had found something the codebase did not contain. She documented it carefully. The observation, the specific cases that had produced it, the ways in which the observation was consistent with the protocol's broader framework, the ways in which it required a revision of the founding premise. Not a rejection, a refinement. The premise that conventional family structure was an extraction mechanism was accurate. The premise that family structure was necessarily an extraction mechanism was not. The protocol had conflated the two, had built around the first premise as though it were the second, had produced as a consequence an architecture optimized for the prevention of extraction from family, which was a real and important objective, without a corresponding architecture for the cultivation of the kind of family relationship that was not extractive. The heap had no positive model, only a negative one. She documented this. She noted what a positive model might require, the specific elements of the inward architecture that the family she had encountered had developed, the principles that seemed to underlie the cases in which proximity and commitment had been organized without extraction. She noted where she was uncertain. She noted what she could not yet see. She put it in the code base. She marked it as a fork, not a revision of the existing branch, but a new branch that ran alongside it, developing an alternative approach in a domain where the existing branch had a significant gap. She brought it to her mother, not expecting agreement, expecting honest engagement. Yael Farrand read her daughter's documentation in a single sitting. She read it twice. She sat with it for 3 days without responding, not because she was composing a defense, because she was doing what the epistemic's endowment had always required, holding the finding open, resisting the premature closure of either acceptance or rejection, examining it with the specific quality of attention that genuine inquiry required. When she came back to Celine, she did not begin with her conclusion. She began with questions. 30 minutes of questions, specific and technical, about the methodology Celine had used to arrive at the finding, about the cases she had examined, the selection criteria she had applied, the alternative explanation she had considered and rejected, the aspects of the finding she was least certain about. Celine answered all of them. Some well, some partially, some by acknowledging that she did not have a good answer, and that the question identified a genuine gap in her analysis. After the questions, Yael was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I think you're right that the protocol has no positive model for inward relationship architecture." She said, "I'm not sure whether that's a bug or a deliberate choice I made for reasons I've forgotten I made." She said, "I need to go back to the code base and look at whether I documented the reasoning." She went back. She looked. She found, in the section she had written during the protocol's initial design, a note she had not thought about in years. The note said, "The positive model for inward relationship architecture is the subject of a separate development effort. The current design addresses the negative constraint, the prevention of extractive family structure, without specifying the positive architecture that should replace it. This is a known gap. It is left open pending further development." She had left it open, pending further development, and then had not developed it. For reasons she could reconstruct, the urgency of the other elements, the difficulty of the positive specification problem, the gradual displacement of the pending item by more pressing concerns, but that amounted in honest assessment to neglect. She had forgotten the gap was there, or had allowed herself to forget, which was the same thing. She went back to Celine. She said, "I found the note. It was a known gap I didn't close. You've done the development I deferred." She said, "I don't think your fork is a fork. I think it's the continuation of a branch I started and stopped." Celine looked at her. She said, "That's a generous interpretation." Yael said, "It's an accurate one. The note is in the code base. You can read it." She said, "But you're right that what you've developed is something I don't fully understand yet. I need more time with it." She said, "I'm not saying you're right. I'm saying the finding is serious and I haven't processed it fully." She said, "That's different from agreement." Celine said, "I know. I wasn't expecting agreement." Yael said, "What were you expecting?" Celine said this, "What you're doing. Taking it seriously." Yael said, "Did you think I might not?" Celine thought about this honestly. She said, "Yes. The premise about family is the most personal element of the philosophy. It came from things that happened to you. It was the hardest thing in the code base to read because I could feel how much it cost you to arrive at it." She said, "I thought you might not be able to separate the premise from the experience." Yael was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm not sure I have. I'm not sure I can fully. The experience is still the experience." She said, "But the premise is something different. And if the premise is wrong or incomplete, the experience doesn't change that." She said, "The experience is why I arrived at the premise, not why the premise is correct." She said, "That's the distinction I've been trying to hold for the last 3 days." She said, "I'm not there yet, but I'm working on it." Celine looked at her mother. Not with triumph. Not with the satisfaction of having been right. With something that was not quite admiration. Admiration was what you felt toward people who were above you, And she did not think of her mother as above her or below her, but as adjacent, working on the same problems from a different vantage point with different tools developed through different experience. With something closer to recognition. The recognition of a person trying, actually trying, to hold a finding that costs something to hold. Because the epistemics required it. Because the codebase required it. Because the architecture required people who could do this. And because the parent who had built the architecture had decided, at some point in the building, that the architecture was more important than the comfort of being right. Even when the person finding the bug was the person she had made. Even when the finding touched the most personal premises. Even then. The fork was not resolved in that conversation. It was not resolved in the year that followed. Yael worked on it. Celine developed it further. The council engaged with it in 3 separate sessions, each of which produced additional refinements and additional open questions. By the end of the 2nd year, the codebase contained a section that had not previously existed, a genuine positive model for inward relationship architecture, developed from Celine's initial finding and the subsequent collaborative work it had generated. The section was marked as version 0.3, not complete, in active development. With 12 open issues noted, 11 of them identified during the council deliberations and 1 identified by the senior council member who had delivered Celine's stewardship assessment and who had, in the process of engaging with the positive model, found a connection between it and a problem in the relational maintenance domain that the council had been working on separately for 4 years. The connection closed both open issues simultaneously. The council noted this in the codebase with the specific notation reserved for findings that resolved multiple outstanding problems through a single insight. The notation was rare. It had been used 11 times in the protocol's documented history. The most recent use was Celine's. Not because she had been the most capable person in the network's history. Because she had been honest about what the philosophy was missing. And the network had been honest enough to hear it. And had done the work. Which was the only way any codebase ever advanced. One honest finding at a time. Followed by the collective willingness to engage with what the finding required. Which was never comfortable. And was always necessary. And was, in the end, the most reliable test available of whether the architecture was what it claimed to be. Not a monument. A living system. Capable of being corrected by the people it had produced. Willing to be. Which was the proof that it had produced them correctly. That the endowment had worked. That the codebase was genuine. That the philosophy, bugs and all, was worth the forking. Because only things worth building are worth improving. And only things worth improving get built well enough to be corrected. Which was the deepest thing the epistemic's endowment had tried to transmit. Not the specific corrections. The willingness to make them. And to receive them. Even from the people you had made. Especially from them. End of Part 3, the epistemic inheritance. Next, Part 4, the failures. Sovereignty attempted and lost, and why. Thanks for reading MXTM's newsletter. Subscribe for free to receive new posts and support my work with BTC. Send it to 1MPXMPFCJVMX SBPQVRWLUC5BAKNFU6 or with fiat at PayPal, me/Martin Chartrand. Subscribe now. Discussion about this episode. Comments. Res tax. Recent episodes. The Sovereignty Dowry Part 2. 6 hours ago, MXTMAK Pirate 1 VJ Tsunami X. The Sovereignty Dowry Vulnerability. 19 Part hours 3, the Epistemic Inheritance. What the sovereign parent teaches and refuses to. 11. The curriculum that isn't one. Why the children of the sovereign class were handed problems, not answers. 12. Robot stewards and the absence of doctrine when the guardian's only hard-coded instruction is, surface do not prescribe. 13. Proof of competence over proof of blood inheritance gated not by birth order, but by demonstrated function. 14. The codebase is patrimony handing a child an uncompiled system instead of a will. 15. Forking the philosophy. What happens when the heir finds a bug in the parent's worldview, and is right. Part 4, the failures. Sovereignty attempted and lost, and why. 16. The single point they forgot. Every architecture has one. The families who found theirs too late. 17. The heir who wanted a country on the children who traded stateless freedom for legible belonging. 18. The marriage vulnerability how one transfer protocol undid 3 generations of jurisdictional engineering. 19. The jurisdiction that pivoted when the microstate you incorporated your children into changed the law, and you were too distributed to respond. 20. When optimization ate sovereignty the families who over-indexed on genetics and underbuilt the legal moat. Part 5. The unlocatable. The heir the model couldn't price. 21. Born in no record a child with no genomic certificate, no birth jurisdiction, no proof of intent filing, and what that made possible. 22. The distributed cohort simultaneous heirs across non-aligned families, the multi-sig bloodline in practice. 23. What Prodigy's engine couldn't find not an anomaly, an absence, the asset that resists monetization by refusing to appear in the dataset. 24. Sovereignty as inheritance the final gift is not wealth, not genetics, not even a code base. It is the structural conditions under which a human being cannot be reduced to a claim. Epilogue the dowry letter. What one sovereign parent wrote, encrypted and time-locked for their heir's 30th birthday. Appendix. On the difference between a vault and a protocol, for those still deciding which to build. The sovereignty dowry is not against Prodigy LLC. It is what Prodigy's best clients were doing while Prodigy's engineers optimized the genome. Evolution doesn't optimize for profit. Sovereignty doesn't optimize for legibility. Burn the will. Ship the protocol. Pirate first. Recent episodes. The Great Bounce. April 30th. Sovereign by design. April. Hyperreality races Deleuze. April. Hyperreality is infrastructure. April 27th. Marcado. Reclamado. Repropuesto. April 25th. MX. Marked. Reclaimed. Repurposed. April 24th. MX. Primer. Super Earth. Age of the Apes a series by Pirate First. April 23rd. Super Earth Age of the Apes. Roster. Apex/Cenote set interrupted. April 22nd. Copyright 2026 MXTM and Vitsueke Martin Chartrand.
The Great Bounce. Is Alphabet facing a digital rebellion? The Great
Bounce, or how your inbox became a toll booth.
April 30th, 2026. Pirate First for MXTM's newsletter. There's a quiet violence happening in the pipes. No explosions. No headlines screaming loud enough. Just silence. Emails that never arrive. Messages that dissolve mid-flight. Entire conversations evaporating like humidity over the Yucatan stone. You send. They never receive. Welcome to the Great Bounce.
Structure layers are now operational across the Tulum Sustainable Development Zone. Despite minor data corruption regarding land narrative, the impact report remains positive. The simulation data confirms critical interference levels across the territory. Narrative load is unstable.
Be advised, paranoia is now a product. The risk assessment is maximum.
Remain sovereign amid the noise. As the interference level spikes, their simulation engagement increases.
We must decipher the reality of this update.
Attention. Signal integrity is failing.
We have 4% uptime before the broadcast load collapses. Decipher the transmission and act immediately.
4-2.
The 1%. A post-scarcity transition doctrine. A post-scarcity secession doctrine.
Martin Chartrand. Subscribe. Short post. They built a system that profits when you're gone. So don't leave them anything to inherit. Build what can't be owned. Ship what can't be seized. Pirate first.
I mean,
Hashtag.
we all use the same tech infrastructure now.
Exactly. And we are just replacing the old cognitive hierarchy of human managers with a new, much less transparent hierarchy of algorithmic filtering. If a redundant worker is told, hey, your life's meaning will now be negotiated by a black box AI in the shadow of a billionaire's real estate project, they aren't going to see a metabolic center for future validation. They are going to see a gilded cage.
Hashtag pirate first, hashtag MXTM, hashtag sovereign stack, hashtag build in public, hashtag decentralization, hashtag exit the system, hashtag protocol not people, hashtag digital sovereignty, hashtag future of work, hashtag creator economy, hashtag cryptoculture, hashtag seasteading, hashtag AI revolution, hashtag post-scarcity, hashtag on your keys, hashtag think different. Discussion about this episode. Comments. Res tax. Recent episodes. Hyperreality races to lose. Hyperreality is infrastructure. Marcado. Reclamado. Reperpuesto. Marked. Reclaimed. Repurposed. Primer. Super Earth. Age of the Apes A series by Pirate First. Super Earth Age of the Apes. Roster. Apex/Cenote set interrupted. Super Earth. Age of the Apes teaser. Introduction. The 1% plus debate.
They control the narrative now, hiding deep within the anomaly. But the story is the territory, and soon...
A hidden longevity civilization beneath the Grand Mayan aquifer seeds, a successor species engineered for extreme worlds.
Every system failed at night, so we built with bone and might.
We chose not to return.
So we built. You can follow the flame or remain what you were. Just a different time. Only
We are
what
crossing the
will
threshold of
endure.
civilizational inversion, where intelligence has ceased to be a scarce resource, dissolving the hierarchy that has organized our species for millennia. The central argument posits that the information asymmetry, which once made obedience rational, has vanished. As the capacity for synthesis becomes universal and inexpensive, traditional institutions become hollow shells that can no longer claim authority through titles or credentials. This transformation brings more than mere technological unemployment. It signals the structural extinction of the professional role.
Proof of personhood, the high stakes of OpenAI's post-anonymous social network. The human dividend, why your identity is the new global currency.
Conclusion at the end of the anonymous web. As we stand in late January 2026, OpenAI's humans-only network remains a tantalizing, yet polarizing, leaked blueprint.
Subscribe.
Shadow fame spreads without permission.
X Prize. Start building, man.
Marked. Reclaimed. Repurposed.